picture a grand English manor, glittering with chandeliers and secrets, where a priceless sapphire necklace vanishes during a dazzling charity ball. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, steps into a web of deception, where a desperate maid, a charming financier, a nervous jeweller, and a noble hostess all hide their motives. As clues unravel in shadowed alcoves and whispered confessions, Marple uncovers a tale of loyalty, greed, and betrayal. Will she find the jewel before the truth slips away? Dive into the missing sapphire necklace, where every glance hides a secret. Chapter 1. The Glittering Gala. The ballroom of Haverford Manor shimmered with opulence, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across the polished parquet floor. The charity ball, an annual affair to benefit the village hospital, drew a crowd of local gentry and a few distinguished visitors from London, all draped in silks and satins that rustled with every step. Lady Beatrice Haverford, the manor's mistress, stood at the centre of it all, her poise as impeccable as the sapphire necklace that adorned her slender neck. The jewel, a cascade of deep blue stones set in intricate silver filigree, caught the candlelight and seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing admiring glances from every corner of the room. Miss Jane Marple, tucked unobtrusively into a velvet-upholstered chair near the fireplace, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet attentiveness. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the orchestra's waltz, as she worked on a pale pink shawl for a niece. To the casual observer, she was merely a quaint elderly spinster, her white hair neatly pinned and her eyes mild behind steel-rimmed spectacles. But those who knew her understood that Miss Marple missed nothing. Her gaze, deceptively gentle, swept the room, cataloguing the nuances of human behaviour with the precision of a naturalist studying rare birds. Lady Beatrice moved through the throng, her smile gracious, but her eyes alert, as if conscious of the weight of her heirloom. She paused to greet Mr. Reginald Thornton, a financier whose polished charm and tailored evening suit made him a favourite among the ladies. His laughter rang out, a touch too loud, as he complimented Lady Beatrice on her elegance. Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered on hers, and the faint flush that crept up the hostess's cheeks. A man who enjoys attention, she thought, her needles pausing briefly, and perhaps seeks it for reasons beyond mere vanity. Nearby, Mr. Silas Pembroke, the jeweller who had arrived from London to appraise the necklace for the insurance company, stood apart, his thin frame slightly stooped. His eyes, sharp and assessing, followed the sapphire's gleam with a professional intensity. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had overheard him discussing the jewel's provenance with Lady Beatrice. A gift from a long-dead Haverford ancestor, its value rivalled only by its history. Pembroke's fingers toyed with a gold watch chain, a nervous habit that Miss Marple filed away for later consideration. Among the flurry of servants weaving through the crowd, one figure caught Miss Marple's eye. Ellen Carter, a young maid with a pale, heart-shaped face and eyes that seemed to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. She carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, her movements quick but precise, as if she wished to remain invisible. Yet Miss Marple noticed how Ellen's steps slowed near Lady Beatrice, her head turning slightly toward the necklace before she hurried on. A girl with something on her mind, Miss Marple mused, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm. The orchestra struck up a lively polka, and the guests swirled into motion, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. Lady Beatrice partnered with Mr. Thornton glided across the floor, the sapphire necklace sparkling with each turn. Mr. Pembroke retreated to a corner, his expression unreadable, while Ellen vanished into the crowd, her tray now empty. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her thoughts turning to the village of St. Mary Mead, where she had once known a parlour maid who pilfered silver spoons to fund a sweetheart's gambling debts. People are much the same everywhere, she reflected, and jewels have a way of tempting even the most honest hearts. As the evening wore on, the air grew warm with the press of bodies and the glow of candlelight. Miss Marple, content to remain a spectator, sipped her lemonade and let her mind wander over the faces around her. The sapphire necklace, she knew, was more than a bauble. It was a symbol of status, a magnet for envy, and perhaps a catalyst for mischief. She did not yet know what the night would bring, but her instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, whispered that all was not as serene as it seemed in Haverford Manor's glittering ballroom. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Jewel. The ballroom of Haverford Manor, moments before a scene of laughter and swirling dance, now hummed with a different energy, a low, electric buzz of shock and suspicion. The clock had just chimed 10. Its resonant toll barely faded, when Lady Beatrice Haverford's screams sliced through the strains of the orchestra's waltz. The music faltered, then stopped, as guests turned to see their hostess standing frozen at the centre of the dance floor, her hands clutching at her bare throat. The sapphire necklace, that magnificent cascade of deep blue stones which had been the evening's unspoken star, was gone. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her quiet corner by the fireplace, set her knitting aside with deliberate calm. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, scanned the room as the crowd erupted into murmurs. Guests pressed closer, some offering sympathy to Lady Beatrice, others whispering speculations. Miss Marple noted the way faces shifted, curiosity mingling with unease, and in some, a flicker of something less innocent. She rose, her small figure moving unobtrusively toward the hostess who stood trembling, her face strained of colour. "My necklace," Lady Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible as Miss Marple reached her side. "It was there, moments ago, during the dance. I felt it slip away, but how? Oh, Miss Marple, it's gone." Her hands fluttered, as if searching for the lost weight of the jewel, and her eyes, wide with distress, darted about the room. Miss Marple patted her arm gently, her tone soothing but firm. Now, Lady Beatrice, let us keep our heads. A thing like this doesn't vanish into thin air. Tell me, when did you last feel it secure?" Her question, simple as it seemed, carried the weight of her quiet authority, and Lady Beatrice blinked, steadying herself. "It was during the waltz with Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice steadier now. "I felt it. Oh, I don't know, perhaps it caught on something. But I didn't notice it gone until I stepped away from the dance." Her gaze flickered toward Reginald Thornton, who stood nearby, his handsome face composed, but his eyes watchful. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the details. A waltz, a crowded floor, the press of bodies, opportunity enough for a deft hand. She recalled the village fete in St. Mary Mead, where a pickpocket had lifted a brooch from Mrs. Clement during a lively quadrille. "Crowds make mischief easy," she thought, her gaze drifting to the edges of the room. The local constable, Inspector Harold Crane, arrived with commendable speed, his broad frame filling the doorway as he strode in, his face set in a mixture of determination and mild exasperation. He was a man of method, Miss Marple noted, but not imagination. A plodder, not a visionary. "Nobody leaves this room," he barked, signalling to a young sergeant who hovered nervously behind him. "Doors locked, windows checked. We'll get to the bottom of this." The guests, accustomed to deference, complied with a mixture of indignation and curiosity, their chatter subsiding into an uneasy hush. Inspector Crane approached Lady Beatrice, notebook in hand, and began his questions with the bluntness of a man unused to delicacy. "Lady Haverford, describe the necklace, if you please. And when exactly did you notice it missing?" "It's a sapphire necklace," she replied, her voice catching. 7 large stones, set in silver with smaller diamonds between. A family heirloom, worth, I can't bear to think of it. I noticed it gone just now, after the waltz. I felt a tug, perhaps, but I thought it was my shawl." Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, listened as the inspector scribbled notes. She observed the crowd, her eyes lingering on the suspect she had already marked. Mr. Reginald Thornton, the financier, stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his smile a shade too polished. Mr. Silas Pembroke, the jeweller, hovered near a side table, his thin fingers adjusting his cufflinks, as he watched the proceedings with a guarded expression. And Ellen Carter, the maid, had reappeared from the servants' passage, her tray now absent, her face pale, and her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in Ellen's hands, and the way she stood just outside the circle of light cast by the chandelier, as if hoping to escape notice. The inspector, having finished with Lady Beatrice, turned to the room at large. "Right then," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority. "I'll need to speak with anyone who was near Lady Haverford during the dance. And you," he pointed at Thornton, "you were dancing with her, weren't you?" Thornton inclined his head, his charm undimmed. "I had the pleasure, yes. A delightful waltz, though I'm afraid I noticed nothing amiss with the necklace." Lady Beatrice was the picture of elegance. His compliment was met with a weak smile from the hostess, but Miss Marple caught the brief tightening of his jaw, as if he were measuring his words. "And you, sir?" Crane turned to Pembroke, who started slightly. "You appraised the necklace today, didn't you? Anything unusual about it?" Pembroke cleared his throat, his voice dry but precise. "Nothing unusual. The clasp was secure, the stones genuine. I examined it thoroughly this afternoon. A magnificent piece, worth a small fortune." His eyes flicked to Lady Beatrice, then away, and Miss Marple wondered at the hint of unease in his manner. The inspector's gaze settled on Ellen next, who shrank under his scrutiny. "You girl, what's your name?" "Were you near Lady Haverford during the dance?" "Ellen Carter, sir," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was serving drinks, sir, moving about the room." "I didn't see anything." Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up her neck, a telltale sign of nerves. Crane grunted, clearly dissatisfied with the vagueness of the responses. "We'll search the room first," he declared, "every inch of it, and then we'll talk to each of you properly." He gestured to his sergeant, who began directing guests to stand aside as a cursory search of the ballroom commenced. Footmen and maids under Crane's orders checked under tables, behind curtains, and along the edges of the dance floor, but the necklace was nowhere to be found. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had slipped away from the main group and was examining the spot where Lady Beatrice had stood during her waltz. The parquet floor gleamed under the chandelier's light, but she knelt carefully, her fingers brushing the surface. Nothing caught her eye, no glint of silver, no trace of a sapphire. She straightened, her thoughts drifting to a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, where a child's lost ring had been found caught in a lady's petticoat. "A necklace doesn't simply fall," she murmured to herself. "It's either taken or hidden." Returning to Lady Beatrice's side, she asked, "Did you dance with anyone else after Mr. Thornton, or move about the room?" Lady Beatrice frowned, her brow creasing as she thought. "No, I don't think so." I stepped away to catch my breath, near the alcove by the French windows. I spoke to a few guests, Mrs. Langley perhaps and Mr. Pembroke came by to compliment the necklace. Then I felt for it, and it was gone. Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the sequence. The alcove by the French windows was a shadowed corner, partially screened by heavy velvet curtains. A perfect spot for a thief to linger unnoticed. She glanced at Ellen, who had resumed her duties, now clearing empty glasses with a mechanical air. The maid's movements were swift, but Miss Marple caught the way her eyes darted toward the alcove, as if drawn by some unspoken anxiety. Inspector Crane, having overseen the fruitless search, called for the suspects to be gathered in the library for further questioning. The guests, restless but curious, were allowed to remain in the ballroom under the sergeant's watch, while Lady Beatrice Thornton, Pembroke and Ellen were escorted to the library's sombre confines. Miss Marple followed, her presence so unassuming that no one questioned her inclusion. The library, with its dark oak shelves and leather-bound volumes, felt like a stage set for revelation, and Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resumed as a pretext for observation. Crane stood before the group, his notebook open, his manner brisk. "Let's have it straight," he said. "Lady Haverford, you say the necklace was taken during or after the waltz? Mr. Thornton, you were with her. Did you see anyone close enough to tamper with it?" Thornton spread his hands, his expression one of earnest regret. "I'm afraid I was too caught up in the dance, Inspector." The room was crowded, people brushing past. I didn't notice anyone lingering unduly. His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple detected a practiced quality, as if he had rehearsed his response. Pembroke, when questioned, reiterated his earlier statement. "The clasp was sound when I examined it. If it came loose, it wasn't due to any flaw I saw." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around his watch chain, a gesture she associated with unease in the village chemist back home. Ellen, last to speak, repeated her claim of being busy with her tray. "I was back and forth from the kitchen, sir." I didn't stop near Lady Haverford. Not once her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the edge of her apron. Miss Marple, watching closely, recalled a housemaid in St. Mary Mead who had lied about a stolen bracelet, her fingers betraying her just as Ellen's did now. Crane snapped his notebook shut, his frustration evident. "We'll search your belongings next, and the manor top to bottom. This necklace didn't walk off on its own." He turned to Miss Marple, as if suddenly aware of her presence. "And you, ma'am, what's your interest in this?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices things, Inspector." People often reveal more than they intend when they think no one is watching her words, delivered with a gentle lilt, hung in the air, and she saw Thornton's smile falter, Pembroke's eyes narrow, and Ellen's shoulders stiffen. As the group dispersed to await further instructions, Miss Marple remained in the library, her knitting needles clicking softly. The sapphire necklace, she knew, was more than a jewel. It was a key to human motives, to greed, fear, or perhaps something deeper. She thought of the alcove, the crowded dance, and Ellen's nervous hands. A thief needs opportunity, she mused, but also a reason. And in the quiet of the library, with the weight of suspicion settling over Haverford Manor, Miss Marple began to piece together the puzzle, her mind as sharp and relentless as the needles in her hands. Chapter 3. The Suspects Assembled. The library of Haverford Manor, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and the faint scent of old paper, seemed to absorb the tension of the moment, as if the very walls held their breath. The heavy oak door closed behind Inspector Crane with a soft thud, sealing the small group of suspects within the room's sombre confines. Lady Beatrice Haverford sat in a high-backed chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes still red from the shock of her loss. Mr. Reginald Thornton leaned against a bookcase, his posture casual, but his fingers drumming lightly on the wood, betraying a restless energy. Mr. Silas Pembroke stood near the fireplace, his thin frame silhouetted against the flickering glow, while Ellen Carter, the maid, hovered near the door, her face pale and her hands twisting the hem of her apron. Miss Jane Marple, unobtrusive as ever, settled into a corner armchair, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm, her presence so unassuming that she seemed almost part of the furniture. Inspector Crane, his notebook open and his manner brisk, surveyed the group with a frown that suggested he found the entire affair a personal affront. "Right," he began, his voice cutting through the silence. "We've a serious matter here, and I'll have the truth of it. A necklace like that doesn't vanish without help. One of you knows more than you're letting on." His eyes moved from face to face, lingering on each suspect as if expecting a confession to spring forth unbidden. Miss Marple, her eyes half-lidded as she knitted, observed the subtle shifts in demeanour. Lady Beatrice's lips trembled, but her posture remained erect, as if pride alone held her together. Thornton's smile was a touch too fixed, his charm a polished shield. Pembroke's fingers, as ever, toyed with his watch chain, a nervous tick that Miss Marple found increasingly telling. And Ellen, poor Ellen, seemed to shrink under the inspector's gaze, her eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, as if it might offer escape. Crane turned first to Lady Beatrice, his tone softening slightly out of deference. "Lady Haverford, let's start with you. You say the necklace was taken during or after the waltz. Can you think of anyone who might have a reason to steal it? Any enemies, perhaps, or someone with a grudge?" Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. "Enemies? Good heavens, no! The necklace is a family heirloom, Inspector, cherished for generations. I can't imagine why anyone would take it from me. I've no debts, no scandals, nothing to invite such a thing." Her voice, though steady, carried a note of indignation, as if the very idea of her involvement was an insult. Miss Marple, however, noted the quick glance she cast toward Thornton, a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, that passed as swiftly as it came. Crane jotted a note, then turned to Thornton, his expression hardening. "Mr. Thornton, you were dancing with Lady Haverford when she last felt the necklace. You must have seen something, someone close perhaps, or an odd movement." Thornton straightened, his smile unwavering but his eyes cautious. "I'm afraid I was quite absorbed in the dance, Inspector." Lady Beatrice is a delightful partner, and the room was a whirl of people. I noticed nothing unusual, though I wish I had. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness, but Miss Marple caught the way his fingers tightened briefly, as if gripping an unspoken thought. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, a charming rogue who had talked his way out of a theft charge with just such a smile, only to be caught later with a stolen watch in his pocket. "And you, Mr. Pembroke," Crane said, shifting his attention to the jeweller, who started slightly, as if pulled from a reverie. "You handled the necklace today. Anything about it that might explain how it came loose? A faulty clasp, perhaps?" Pembroke cleared his throat, his voice precise but tinged with unease. "The clasp was perfectly sound, Inspector. I examined it thoroughly this afternoon. A delicate mechanism, yes, but secure. If it came undone, it was through no fault of the design." His eyes darted to Lady Beatrice, then back to Crane, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. A man with something to hide, she thought, or perhaps merely one unaccustomed to scrutiny. Finally, Crane's gaze settled on Ellen, who seemed to shrink further into herself. "Miss Carter, you were serving drinks during the dance. You must have been close to Lady Haverford at some point. Did you see anyone near her? Anyone acting strangely?" Ellen's voice was barely audible, her words stumbling over each other. "No, sir. I was busy, sir, carrying trays, fetching glasses. I didn't see anything, honest." Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, and Miss Marple observed the way her hands clenched, the knuckles whitening against the black fabric of her apron. There was fear there, she thought, but whether of guilt or something else, she could not yet say. She remembered a housemaid in St. Mary Mead, dismissed for stealing a silver spoon, whose trembling hands had given her away long before the evidence was found. Crane snapped his notebook shut, his frustration evident in the sharp movement. "Very well," he said. "None of you saw anything, it seems. But I'll wager one of you knows more than you're saying. We'll search your rooms next, and the manor from top to bottom. If that necklace is here, we'll find it." He turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowing. "And you, Miss Marple, is it? You've been awfully quiet. Got anything to add?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her expression mild, but her eyes bright with interest. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to watch people, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But I find that when something precious goes missing, it's often because someone wanted it very badly indeed. And want, you know, makes people careless." Her words, delivered with a gentle smile, seemed to ripple through the room, and she saw Thornton's smile tighten, Pembroke's fingers pause, and Ellen's shoulders hunch further. Crane grunted, clearly unsure what to make of her cryptic remark. "Right then," he said. "You lot stay here until I say otherwise. Sergeant, keep an eye on them." He strode out, leaving the suspects under the watchful gaze of the young sergeant, who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. As the room settled into an uneasy silence, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking like a metronome. She observed the interplay of glances among the suspects. Lady Beatrice's nervous fidgeting, Thornton's studied nonchalance, Pembroke's restless pacing, and Ellen's rigid stillness. Each, she knew, held a piece of the puzzle, whether they realized it or not. The necklace, she thought, was more than a jewel. It was a mirror, reflecting the desires and fears of those around it. And in that reflection, Miss Marple was certain lay the truth. The sergeant, a lanky young man with a nervous cough, stood by the door, his eyes darting between the suspects. Miss Marple, sensing his discomfort, offered him a reassuring smile, which he returned with a hesitant nod. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who had once described police work as all plod and no sparkle. Inspector Crane, she decided, was all plod, but she would provide the sparkle, if only by seeing what others overlooked. Lady Beatrice broke the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is intolerable," she said, addressing no one in particular. "That necklace has been in my family for generations. To think it's stolen under my own roof, it's monstrous." Her eyes sought Thornton's, as if for reassurance, but he merely nodded, his expression sympathetic but distant. Thornton spoke next, his tone light but calculated. "It's a beastly business, Lady Beatrice, but I'm sure the inspector will sort it out. These things often turn up in the oddest places." His words were meant to comfort, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Pembroke, as if gauging the jeweller's reaction. Pembroke, catching the glance, bristled. "If you're implying anything, mister?" "Thornton, I assure you I had no part in this. I'm a professional, not a common thief." His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple wondered at the defensiveness behind it. A man with a reputation to protect, she thought, or perhaps something more. Ellen said nothing, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her fingers twisted the apron's hem into a tight knot. There was a story there, she was sure, one that went beyond the duties of a maid. She thought of a girl in St. Mary Mead who had stolen to help a wayward brother, her loyalty outweighing her fear of consequence. "People do strange things for those they love," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles never faltering. As the minutes stretched on, the tension in the room grew, each suspect retreating into their own thoughts. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, let her mind wander over the evening's events. The crowded dance, the shadowed alcove, the fleeting tug Lady Beatrice had felt. The necklace, she knew, had not vanished by accident. Someone had seen their chance and taken it, driven by a need only they could understand. And as she knitted, her thoughts wove a pattern of their own, one that would, in time, reveal the truth hidden in Haverford Manor's gilded halls. Chapter 4. A Glimpse of Motive. The morning after the charity ball dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight filtering through the tall windows of Haverford Manor's morning room, casting golden patches on the polished mahogany table. Miss Jane Marple, invited to stay for breakfast at Lady Beatrice Haverford's insistence, sat with a cup of tea, her knitting resting in her lap. The room was quiet, save for the soft clink of china as Lady Beatrice poured herself a second cup, her movements betraying a nervous energy. The loss of the sapphire necklace hung over the manor like a shadow, and Miss Marple, ever observant, sensed that the day would bring revelations, however small. Lady Beatrice, dressed in a simple but elegant morning gown, attempted a smile as she offered Miss Marple a scone. "You're very kind to stay, Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained but courteous. This dreadful business has quite upset me, and your presence is a comfort." Her fingers toyed with the edge of a napkin, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand, a sign of distress that went beyond the loss of a jewel. "Oh, it's no trouble at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "A thing like this unsettles everyone, but I find a cup of tea and a bit of conversation often clear the mind. Tell me, Lady Beatrice, have you had the necklace insured? Such a valuable piece must be a worry to maintain." Lady Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flickering with something like discomfort, before she nodded. "Oh yes, it's insured. For a considerable sum, in fact. My late husband insisted on it, though I never thought we'd need to claim it." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her tea, as if the mention of the insurance stirred an unwelcome thought. Miss Marple, sipping her own tea, filed the detail away, recalling a case in St. Mary Mead, where a farmer's wife had insured a silver teapot just before it mysteriously vanished, only to be found later in a pawnshop. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a footman, who announced that Inspector Crane was continuing his inquiries in the drawing-room, and had requested Lady Beatrice's presence later. Miss Marple, declining to join the formal interviews, excused herself to take a turn about the Manor's gardens, her mind already turning over the threads of the case. The insurance, she thought, was a significant detail, not proof of guilt, but a potential motive. People she knew sometimes did desperate things when money was involved, and Lady Beatrice's fleeting frown suggested more than simple grief over a lost heirloom. As she strolled along the gravel paths, the autumn air sharp with the scent of damp leaves, Miss Marple's thoughts were drawn to the other suspects. She had not seen Mr. Reginald Thornton since the library questioning, but his name had surfaced in the servants' gossip, overheard as she passed the kitchen earlier. The cook, a stout woman with a penchant for chatter, had mentioned Thornton's recent financial troubles, investments gone sour, debts mounting, and a certain urgency in his manner when he visited the manor. "Always so charming," the cook had said, "but you can tell he's stretched thin, poor man." Miss Marple, pausing to admire a late-blooming rose, reflected on Thornton's polished demeanour during the ball. Charm, she knew, could mask calculation, as it had with a young curate in St. Mary Mead, who had swindled half the parish before his debts caught up with him. Her walk took her past the stables, where she spotted Mr. Silas Pembroke, the jeweller, standing alone near the carriage-house, his thin frame hunched as he studied something in his hand. A small notebook, perhaps, or a letter. He glanced up, startled, as Miss Marple approached, and quickly tucked the object into his pocket. "Good morning, Mr. Pembroke," she said brightly, her tone as disarming as a village spinster's. "Taking the air?" "It's a fine day for it, though I dare say you're more accustomed to the bustle of London." Pembroke managed a thin smile, his fingers brushing his watch chain in that familiar nervous gesture. "Indeed, Miss Marple, I find the country a bit quiet for my taste. But the Manor's gardens are pleasant enough." His voice was polite, but his eyes were guarded, and Miss Marple sensed he was eager to end the conversation. "I imagine your work keeps you busy," she continued, undeterred. "Appraising jewels must be fascinating, though I suppose it comes with its pressures. A piece like Lady Beatrice's necklace must attract all sorts of attention." She paused, her expression one of innocent curiosity, but her words carried a subtle probe. Pembroke's smile faltered. "It's a fine piece, yes. But my business thrives on discretion, not attention. I've appraised many such jewels without incident." His tone was clipped, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered near his pocket, as if protecting whatever he had hidden there. She thought of a jeweller in St. Mary Mead who had once undervalued a brooch to curry favour with a client, only to be caught when the client's daughter questioned the appraisal. A man in debt to his reputation, she mused, is as vulnerable as one in debt to his banker. Bidding Pembroke a cheerful goodbye, Miss Marple continued her walk, her thoughts turning to Ellen Carter, the maid. Ellen had been notably absent that morning, her duties seemingly confined to the servants' quarters since the inspector's questioning. Miss Marple, with her knack for finding the unnoticed, made her way to the scullery, where she found Ellen scrubbing a pile of silver cutlery with a vigour that suggested more than mere diligence. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed, and a faint bruise on her wrist caught Miss Marple's attention, a mark she had not noticed in the dim light of the ballroom. "Good morning, Ellen," Miss Marple said kindly, settling onto a stool near the scullery door. "You've a heavy task there. I always think polishing silver is rather like polishing one's thoughts. It takes patience to see things clearly." Ellen started, nearly dropping a fork, and managed a weak smile. "Yes, ma'am. Just doing my work, ma'am." Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in it, and the way her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting interruption. "You must be tired after last night's excitement," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, but her gaze steady. "Such a grand ball, and then that dreadful business with the necklace. I suppose you were run off your feet, serving all those guests." Ellen nodded, her hands resuming their work, though less steadily now. "Yes, ma'am, it was busy, what with all the trays and glasses. I didn't see much, just kept moving." Her words were rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush creeping up her neck, a sign she had seen in a saint. Mary Mead's shop girl, who had pocketed a customer's change to buy medicine for her sick mother. "I expect you know the manner well working here," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "You must see things others miss. Little details, perhaps, that might help the inspector." She paused, watching Ellen's reaction. The girl's hands faltered, and the bruise on her wrist seemed more pronounced in the morning light. "It's not my place to notice things, ma'am," Ellen said quickly, her eyes fixed on the silver. "I just do my work." But her voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the fear in her posture, the way she seemed to draw into herself. "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. "But sometimes, Ellen, the smallest things matter most. Like a kind word to a friend in trouble." She left the scullery, her mind turning over the bruise, the fear, and the gossip she had overheard about Ellen's brother. A lad, the cook had said, who had fallen in with rough company and owed money to men who did not take kindly to delays. As she returned to the manor, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. Lady Beatrice's insurance, Thornton's debts, Pembroke's unease, and Ellen's fear. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the case. The sapphire necklace, she knew, was not merely stolen. It was wanted, perhaps desperately, by someone in this house. And as she entered the drawing-room, where Inspector Crane was preparing for his next round of questions, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of certainty that the truth, like her knitting, would come together stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 5. The Maid's Secret. The late morning sun filtered through the yew hedges of Haverford Manor's gardens, casting dappled shadows on the gravel paths where Miss Jane Marple continued her leisurely stroll. Her small, neat figure moved with a deceptive air of aimlessness, her eyes taking in the orderly flower beds and the distant hum of activity from the Manor's kitchens. The sapphire necklace's theft had stirred the household into a state of restless unease, and Miss Marple, with her knack for uncovering the hidden currents beneath polite surfaces, felt the weight of secrets yet unspoken. Her morning's conversation with Lady Beatrice and her brief encounter with Mr. Pembroke had sharpened her curiosity, but it was Ellen Carter, the maid, who now occupied her thoughts. The girl's nervous demeanour and that telltale bruise on her wrist suggested a story that went beyond the duties of a servant. Miss Marple's walk took her toward the service wing of the manor, where the clatter of pots and the murmur of voices signalled the preparations for luncheon. She paused near a small herb garden, ostensibly to admire the rosemary, but her true purpose was to observe the comings and goings of the staff. Through an open window, she glimpsed Ellen Carter in the scullery. Her slender frame bent over a sink piled with crystal glasses from the previous night's ball. The girl's movements were quick, almost frantic, as if she sought to lose herself in her work. Miss Marple, with the patience of one who had spent years watching human nature unfold, decided it was time for a closer look. She entered the scullery through a side door, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. Ellen started at the sound, her hands freezing mid-scrub, a glass dripping water onto her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice high with surprise. "I didn't hear you come in." Her eyes, wide and shadowed, darted to the door, then back to the sink, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush that crept up her cheeks. "No need to be alarmed, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. She settled onto a wooden stool near the scrubbed pine table, her knitting bag resting at her feet. "I only thought I'd see how you're getting on. It's been a trying time for everyone, hasn't it? A grand ball one moment, and such a fuss the next." She drew out her needles and a skein of pale pink wool, her fingers moving with practised ease as she began to knit. Ellen nodded, resuming her work, though her hands trembled slightly. "Yes, ma'am. It's been upsetting, what with the necklace and all." Her voice was soft, but there was a tightness to it, as if each word were carefully chosen. Miss Marple's eyes, gentle but piercing, caught the faint bruise on the girl's wrist, now more visible in the daylight streaming through the window. It was a small mark, purple and mottled, as if caused by a tight grip rather than a clumsy fall. "You've a bruise there, Ellen," Miss Marple remarked, her voice light but direct. "I hope you haven't hurt yourself." These old houses can be treacherous with their narrow stairs and heavy trays. Ellen's hand jerked, and the glass she held slipped into the sink with a soft clink. "Oh, it's nothing, ma'am," she said quickly, pulling her sleeve down to cover the mark. "Just a clumsy moment, carrying too many things at once." But her eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and her fingers resumed scrubbing with a vigour that seemed more about distraction than cleanliness. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was alert. She thought of a young girl in St. Mary Mead, a dairymaid who had borne similar bruises, the result of a bullying sweetheart who pressed her for money she didn't have. "Clumsiness covers many things," she said softly, almost to herself. "But sometimes, my dear, it's not the fall that leaves a mark, but the hand that causes it." Ellen's face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought the girl might drop another glass. But she recovered, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just doing my work." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "But you know, in my village we had a girl much like you, hard-working, quiet, always ready to help. She had a brother who got into trouble, borrowing from the wrong sort of people. It weighed on her, poor thing, until she did something quite out of character to help him." She paused, watching Ellen's reaction. The girl's hands stilled, and her breath caught, a small, sharp sound in the quiet scullery. "My brother's got nothing to do with this," Ellen said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "He's in London, working as a clerk. He's not in trouble." But the words came too quickly, and Miss Marple saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear she had seen in the saint. Mary Mead girl who had stolen to save her brother from ruin. "I'm sure he's a good lad," Miss Marple said gently, her tone inviting confidence. "But family can be a heavy burden, can't it? Especially when they're far away, and you hear they're in need. It's only natural to want to help." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but unwavering. "If there's anything troubling you, Ellen, sometimes a quiet word can lighten the load." Ellen's hands gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might speak, but the girl shook her head, her lips trembling. "There's nothing, ma'am. I swear it. I didn't see anything last night, and I don't know about the necklace." Her voice broke, and she turned back to the glasses, scrubbing with renewed intensity. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked back into her bag. "Well, I won't keep you from your work," she said, her smile warm, but her mind racing. "But if you change your mind, I'm always happy to listen. We old ladies have seen a great deal, you know, and we're not so easily shocked." She moved toward the door, pausing to add, "Take care of that wrist, my dear. Bruises can linger if they're not tended." As she stepped back into the herb garden, Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the encounter. Ellen's fear was palpable, and that bruise was no accident. The gossip about her brother, overheard in the kitchen, painted a picture of a young man entangled with unsavory lenders, the kind who might demand payment in ways that left marks on a sister's wrist. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a blacksmith's daughter had pawned her mother's locket to free her brother from a gambling debt, only to be caught when the pawnbroker grew suspicious. "Desperation," she murmured, "makes thieves of the most unlikely people." She glanced back at the scullery window, where Ellen's silhouette was still visible, bent over her task. The girl was hiding something, Miss Marple was certain, and it was tied to the necklace's disappearance. The sapphire, with its allure of wealth, could tempt even a timid soul like Ellen, especially if it meant saving someone she loved. But how had she managed it, in a crowded ballroom with eyes everywhere? Miss Marple's mind returned to the alcove by the French windows, that shadowed corner where Lady Beatrice had paused after her dance. A quick hand, a moment's distraction, possible, but risky. Ellen's role, she decided, warranted closer attention. As she made her way back to the manor, Miss Marple resolved to keep an eye on the maid and to listen for any further whispers about her brother. The sapphire necklace, she knew, was more than a jewel. It was a catalyst, exposing the frailties and fears of those around it. And as she entered the house, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase, not for the necklace itself, but for the truth it concealed. Chapter 6. The Jeweller's Tale. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Haverford Manor's drawing-room, casting long shadows across the Aubusson carpet. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair with her knitting in her lap, appeared to be engrossed in her pale pink shawl. But her eyes were alert, taking in the room's quiet tension. The search for the sapphire necklace had yielded nothing so far, and Inspector Crane's brusque inquiries had left the household on edge. Miss Marple, however, preferred her own methods, gentle conversation, a touch of flattery, and the patience to let secrets slip. Her encounter with Ellen Carter had sharpened her suspicions, but now her thoughts turned to Mr. Silas Pembroke, the jeweller, whose nervous demeanour and guarded responses suggested a story yet untold. She had arranged to meet Pembroke under a pretext of discussing a brooch she claimed to own, a modest piece from her saint, Mary Mead Days, which she described with just enough detail to pique his professional interest. He arrived promptly, his thin frame clad in a meticulously pressed suit, his fingers already fidgeting with the gold watch chain that seemed an extension of his unease. "Miss Marple," he said, managing a tight smile as he took the seat opposite her. "I understand you wish to discuss a piece of jewellery." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, her voice bright and disarming. "Just a little brooch. Nothing grand like Lady Beatrice's necklace, but it's dear to me. I thought a jeweller of your expertise might offer some advice on its care." She paused, her needles clicking softly, and added, "Though I imagine you're quite preoccupied with this dreadful business about the necklace. Such a magnificent piece. It must be a heavy responsibility to appraise something so valuable." Pembroke's smile wavered, and he adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as his shield against scrutiny. "It's a fine piece, certainly," he said, his voice measured. "One of the finest I've seen in years. 7 sapphires, each flawless, set in silver with diamond accents. I examined it thoroughly yesterday morning, and I assure you, it was in perfect condition." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple caught the slight strain in it, as if he were reciting a prepared defence. "How fascinating," she said, her eyes twinkling with feigned innocence. "You must know every detail of such a jewel. The clasp, for instance. Lady Beatrice mentioned it was delicate, prone to slipping, perhaps." Her question was casual, but her gaze was steady, watching for any flicker of reaction. Pembroke's fingers paused on his watch chain, and for a moment his eyes met hers, sharp and wary. "The clasp was secure," he said firmly. "A spring mechanism, finely crafted, but not prone to failure. I tested it myself. If it came undone, it was due to external interference." He hesitated, as if choosing his words with care, and Miss Marple noted the way his shoulders tensed, as if bracing for a challenge. "External interference," she repeated softly, her needles never faltering. "How curious." "In my village we had a jeweller once, a Mr. Tuttle, such a meticulous man, who found that a necklace's clasp could be tampered with, ever so slightly. just enough to make it slip at the right moment. But of course, you'd know all about such things. Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her words carried a subtle probe, and she saw Pembroke's jaw tighten. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I found no signs of tampering," he said, his voice a shade too sharp. "My reputation depends on precision. If the clasp failed, it was not due to any oversight on my part." He leaned back, crossing his arms, and Miss Marple observed the faint flush creeping up his neck, a sign of discomfort she had seen in a saint. Mary Mead Taylor, who had once undervalued a client's furs to hide his own financial straits. "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. "Your expertise is beyond question. Though I suppose a jeweller's life isn't all glamour. Clients can be demanding, and I hear business has been difficult for some in London. A friend of mine mentioned a jeweller who lost a major client recently. Quite a blow." She let the comment hang, her eyes soft but searching, recalling the manor gossip about Pembroke's struggling shop. Pembroke's expression darkened, and he cleared his throat. "The trade has its challenges," he admitted, his voice clipped, "but I manage. My work with Lady Beatrice was a privilege, and I've no need to resort to anything untoward." His fingers resumed their restless dance with the watch chain, and Miss Marple wondered what he had tucked into his pocket during their garden encounter. A ledger, perhaps, or a letter that might reveal more than he intended. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a footman, who brought a tray of sherry at Miss Marple's request. She offered Pembroke a glass, her hospitality a pretext to keep him talking. "You must see such interesting people in your work," she said, sipping her sherry. "I imagine a jewel like Lady Beatrice's necklace attracts all sorts, collectors perhaps, or those who know its value a little too well." Her tone was conversational, but her words were a gentle prod, testing the waters of his composure. Pembroke took a small sip, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Collectors, yes," he said, "and others who appreciate fine things. But I deal only with reputable clients. The necklace's history is well known, and its value is no secret. That's why I insisted on a thorough appraisal." He set his glass down, his movements precise but deliberate, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked toward the door, as if he longed to escape her scrutiny. She nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "How thorough you are," she said, in Saint. "Mary Mead, we had a man who appraised antiques, always so particular about details. But once he overlooked a tiny flaw in a vase, and it caused quite a stir when it was sold. Details, you see, can be so telling." Her voice was gentle, but her implication was clear, and she saw Pembroke's hand tighten around his glass. "I overlook nothing," he said, a touch of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "My appraisal was meticulous. If the necklace was taken, it was a deliberate act, not a fault of the jewel." He rose, smoothing his jacket. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have matters to attend to." "I hope I've been of some help with your brooch." "Oh, most helpful," she said, her smile serene. "You've given me much to think about." As he left the room, his steps brisk, Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the conversation. Pembroke's knowledge of the clasp was too specific, his defensiveness too pronounced. A man with a struggling business, she thought, might see a necklace like that as more than a professional challenge, perhaps a way out of financial ruin. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead jeweller, who had once borrowed a client's ring to secure a loan, only to be undone by his own meticulous records. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple considered the threads of the case. Ellen's fear, Thornton's debts, Lady Beatrice's insurance, and now Pembroke's unease. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and the sapphire necklace was the centre that drew them together. She thought of the alcove, the crowded dance, and the clasp that Pembroke insisted was secure. "A jeweller knows a jewel's weaknesses," she murmured, her needles clicking softly, "and sometimes its temptations." With Inspector Crane's searches continuing, Miss Marple resolved to watch Pembroke closely, certain that his tale, like the necklace itself, held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. Thornton's Alibi. The late afternoon sun bathed Haverford Manor's conservatory in a golden glow, the glass walls amplifying the warmth as exotic ferns and orchids thrived in their humid haven. Miss Jane Marple, invited by Mr. Reginald Thornton for a game of bridge, sat at a wrought-iron table, her knitting temporarily set aside in favour of a fan of cards. The conservatory, with its lush greenery and delicate scent of blooming jasmine, was an unlikely setting for probing questions, but Miss Marple knew that even the most casual moments could yield truths. Thornton, with his easy charm and polished manners, had suggested the game as a diversion from the unpleasantness of the necklace's theft, but Miss Marple suspected his invitation held more purpose than mere sociability. Thornton, impeccably dressed in a light summer suit, dealt the cards with a practised hand, his smile as bright as the sunlight streaming through the glass. Across from him sat Mrs. Langley, a widow of considerable means and a guest at the ball, who had agreed to join the game at Thornton's request. The fourth player, a nervous young curate named Mr. Ellison, fidgeted with his cards, clearly out of his depth among such company. Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling with feigned innocence, observed Thornton closely, noting the effortless way he steered the conversation, his laughter filling the air like a well-rehearsed melody. "What a splendid idea this was, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice light as she played a card. "A game of bridge does take one's mind off things, doesn't it? Though I dare say the loss of Lady Beatrice's necklace must weigh heavily on us all." Her tone was conversational, but her gaze was sharp, watching for any shift in Thornton's composure. Thornton's smile remained fixed, though his eyes flicked briefly to hers. "A beastly affair, Miss Marple," he said, laying down a trump with a flourish, "but I'm sure Inspector Crane will have it sorted soon enough. These things often turn up, where least expected." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his fingers on the cards, a gesture reminiscent of a saint. Mary Mead Cardsharp, who had once tried to bluff his way out of a debt. Mrs. Langley, fanning herself with her cards, nodded in agreement. "Oh, indeed. I was dancing near Lady Beatrice during that waltz, and I saw nothing amiss. Though, Mr. Thornton, you were her partner. Surely you'd have noticed if someone got too close." Her question was innocent, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes lingered on Thornton, as if seeking confirmation of a memory. Thornton leaned back, his posture relaxed but his smile a touch too deliberate. "I'm afraid I was too enchanted by the dance to notice much else, Mrs. Langley. Lady Beatrice is a graceful partner, and the room was a whirl of people. I do recall we stepped toward the alcove afterward. She wanted a moment to catch her breath, but I saw no one tampering with her necklace." His words were polished, but Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality. as if he had anticipated the question. She played a card, her expression one of mild curiosity. "The alcove by the French windows, you mean? Such a charming spot, though rather shadowed. I suppose it's the sort of place where one might not notice a quick hand." Her tone was gentle, but her words carried a subtle challenge, and she saw Thornton's smile flicker, just for a moment. "Quite so," he said, recovering quickly. "But I assure you, I was with her only briefly before she moved on to speak with others. I joined Mrs. Langley for the next dance, didn't I?" He turned to the widow. His charm turned full force, but Miss Marple noted the hesitation in Mrs. Langley's nod, as if her memory were less certain than he wished. "Oh, yes, I believe so," Mrs. Langley said, her voice uncertain. "Though it was such a crowded evening, one loses track of the order of things." She laughed nervously, and Miss Marple made a mental note of the discrepancy. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper's wife had once vouched for her husband's alibi, only to falter when pressed on the details, revealing his absence during a theft. As the game continued, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward lighter topics, asking Thornton about his life in London. He spoke readily of his work as a financier, his anecdotes laced with names of prominent investors and grand ventures. But Miss Marple, with her ear for nuance, caught the strain beneath his bravado. The way his laughter rang a touch too loud when he mentioned a recent deal, the manor gossip about his financial troubles, debts mounting, investments failing, echoed in her mind, and she recalled a saint. Mary Mead merchant who had smiled just as brightly while his shop teetered on ruin. "You must lead a busy life," she said, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting between plays. "All those investments, such responsibility. I imagine a man in your position must always be looking for opportunities, like an insurance payout perhaps for a valuable jewel." Her tone was airy, almost absent-minded, but her eyes were keen, watching for his reaction. Thornton's hand paused over the table, his card hovering before he played it. "Insurance payouts?" he said, his voice light but his eyes narrowing. "I'm no expert in such matters, Miss Marple. My interests lie in stocks and bonds, not jewels, though I suppose Lady Beatrice's necklace would fetch a tidy sum if claimed." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound, and Miss Marple saw Mrs. Langley glance at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "The curate, mister." Ellison fumbled his cards, breaking the moment's tension. "Oh dear, I've played the wrong suit," he said, blushing furiously. Miss Marple smiled kindly, using the distraction to observe Thornton further. His mention of the insurance, unprompted, was telling, a slip perhaps, or a deliberate deflection. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead gambler who had once hinted at his own crimes in jest, only to betray himself when the jest was taken seriously. As the game drew to a close, Thornton excused himself, claiming a need to speak with the inspector. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the briskness of his stride, as if he were eager to escape the conservatory's confines. She turned to Mrs. Langley, her voice gentle. "Such a charming man, Mr. Thornton, though I wonder, were you truly dancing with him right after Lady Beatrice? It's so easy to mix up the order of things in a crowded ball." Mrs. Langley hesitated, her fan slowing. "Well, I thought so, but perhaps it was later." The evening was such a blur. Her uncertainty confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Thornton's alibi was not as solid as he claimed. She thanked Mrs. Langley and the curate for the game, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the evening. Thornton's debts, his proximity to Lady Beatrice during the dance, and his vague alibi suggested a man with motive and opportunity. But had he the nerve to steal in plain sight? Miss Marple thought of the alcove, the crowded floor, and the Sapphire's tempting gleam. "A man in debt sees opportunity in chaos," she murmured, her needles clicking as she gathered her things. With the inspector's searches ongoing, she resolved to keep Thornton in her sights, certain that his charm concealed more than it revealed. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Ballroom. The evening shadows lengthened across Haverford Manor's ballroom, where the echoes of the previous night's revelry had given way to an air of quiet scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Inspector Harold Crane, had requested to revisit the scene of the theft, her unassuming presence belying the sharp curiosity that drove her. The chandeliers, now unlit, hung like silent sentinels above the polished parquet floor, and the heavy velvet curtains framing the French windows stirred faintly in the draught. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, moved with a purposeful calm, her eyes scanning the room for details overlooked in the chaos of the night before. Inspector Crane, his notebook in hand, and his expression one of barely concealed impatience, followed her lead, though his skepticism was evident. "I'm not sure what you hope to find, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "We searched this room top to bottom last night. No sign of the necklace, not a glimmer. His boots echoed on the floor, a stark contrast to Miss Marple's soft tread, and she noted his tendency to dismiss what he could not immediately see, much like a saint. Mary Mead Constable, who had once overlooked a stolen purse hidden in plain sight. "Oh, I'm sure you were thorough, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, but her eyes bright with interest. "But sometimes, you know, the smallest things escape notice in the heat of the moment. In my village, we once found a lost earring caught in a rug, simply because someone took a second look." She moved toward the center of the dance floor, where Lady Beatrice had stood during her waltz with Mr. Thornton, her mind reconstructing the evening's events. The ballroom, in daylight, revealed details hidden by the previous night's candlelight. Miss Marple paused where Lady Beatrice had danced, her gaze dropping to the floor. The parquet was pristine, polished to a mirror-like sheen, but she knelt carefully, her fingers brushing the surface. A faint scuff mark, barely visible, caught her eye. A small abrasion, as if someone had stepped heavily or dragged something across the wood. "Curious," she murmured, her voice so soft that Crane leaned closer to hear. "What's that?" he asked, squinting at the floor. "Just a mark from the dancing, surely. This place was packed last night, perhaps," Miss Marple said, rising with a slight smile. "But a mark can tell a story, Inspector." People move differently when they're nervous, or when they're hiding something. Her thoughts drifted to a saint. Mary Mead garden party, where a scuff in the grass had led to the discovery of a stolen bracelet, dropped by a guest in haste. She turned her attention to the alcove by the French windows, where Lady Beatrice had paused after her dance, and beckoned Crane to follow. The alcove, partially screened by thick velvet curtains, was a pocket of shadow even in daylight. Miss Marple stepped behind the curtains, her fingers trailing along the fabric as she examined the floor and walls. The space was narrow, just wide enough for a person to stand unnoticed, and she pictured Ellen Carter, tray in hand, slipping through the crowd. Or perhaps Thornton, lingering after the dance, or Pembroke, with his jeweller's eye for opportunity. Her gaze fell to the base of the curtain, where a single pearl bead, no larger than a pea, lay caught in the hem's fold. It was a delicate thing, milky white and faintly lustrous, but it did not match the sapphires or diamonds of Lady Beatrice's necklace. Miss Marple picked up the bead, holding it to the light. "Now this is interesting," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Not from the necklace, I think, but it suggests someone stood here, perhaps in a hurry." She turned to Crane, her expression one of quiet certainty. A bead like this might come from a gown, or an accessory, or even an apron. If it was caught in a moment of haste, Crane frowned, taking the bead from her and examining it skeptically. "Could be from anyone at the ball," he said. "Dozens of women were wearing pearls. Still, I'll have it noted." He pocketed the bead, his tone suggesting he placed little stock in its significance, but Miss Marple's mind was already racing. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, who had lost a bead from her dress while sneaking into a neighbour's shed. A small clue that had unravelled a theft. The bead, she thought, was a sign of presence. Someone who had lingered in the alcove, perhaps watching, perhaps acting. "Would you mind, Inspector, if we looked a bit further?" Miss Marple asked, her voice deferential but firm. "This alcove is such a discreet spot. A thief might have stood here, waiting for the right moment." She moved to the French windows, testing the latch. It was secure, but the glass panes offered a clear view of the terrace beyond, where a gravel path led to the gardens. "No one left through here, I suppose?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Crane's earlier report. "No, ma'am," Crane said, his patience wearing thin. "Windows were locked, and the sergeant checked the terrace last night. Nothing out there but footprints from the gardeners." He shifted his weight, clearly eager to return to his interviews, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the alcove's edges. She stepped back to the curtain, running her fingers along the hem where the bead had been found. The fabric was heavy, capable of concealing a figure, and she pictured the crowded ballroom, the swirl of dancers, and Lady Beatrice pausing here to catch her breath. "Someone stood here, out of sight," she said softly, almost to herself, "and they left something behind." Her thoughts turned to Ellen, whose quick steps and nervous hands had marked her as a figure of interest. The bead could belong to a servant's uniform, perhaps an embellishment on an apron, though Ellen's plain attire seemed unlikely to carry such adornments. Still, the alcove's seclusion and the bead's presence suggested a deliberate act, not a careless one. Crane, growing restless, cleared his throat. "If you're done here, Miss Marple, I've got to get back to the suspects. I'm searching their rooms next, starting with the maids. Care to join me?" His tone was grudging, but Miss Marple sensed he was beginning to value her observations, however reluctantly. "Oh, I think I'll let you handle that, Inspector," she said, her smile serene. "But do let me know what you find. Sometimes the smallest clues lead to the biggest truths." She gathered her knitting bag, her mind already piecing together the scene. The scuff mark, the bead, the shadowed alcove. Each was a fragment of the puzzle, and she felt certain that the thief had stood here, watching Lady Beatrice, waiting for the moment to strike. Whether it was Ellen, driven by desperation, or another with a hidden motive, Miss Marple could not yet say. But as she left the ballroom, her needles clicking softly in her bag, she knew the clue in the alcove was a step closer to the truth, and she resolved to keep her eyes open for the next piece of the Sapphire's story. Chapter 9. The Search and Discovery. The afternoon at Haverford Manor carried a restless air, as if the very walls of the grand house were impatient for the mystery of the sapphire necklace to be resolved. Miss Jane Marple, having returned from her inspection of the ballroom, sat in the morning room with a cup of tea, her knitting needles moving steadily as she pondered the pearl bead and the scuff mark in the alcove. Inspector Harold Crane, true to his methodical nature, had organized a thorough search of the suspect's rooms, and the manor buzzed with the quiet efficiency of footmen and maids under his direction. Miss Marple, content to observe from the sidelines, knew that searches often revealed more than their seekers intended, and she was eager to hear what might be uncovered. Inspector Crane, his face set in a determined scowl, had begun with the servants' quarters, reasoning that Ellen Carter, as the least prominent suspect, might be the most likely to hide something tangible. Miss Marple, invited to join the search as a courtesy, followed at a discreet distance, her small figure blending into the background as the inspector and his sergeant ascended the narrow staircase to the attic rooms. The servants' quarters were plain, with whitewashed walls and simple furnishings, a stark contrast to the manor's opulent lower floors. Ellen's room, at the end of a dim corridor, was a small space with a single window overlooking the stables, its contents limited to a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a chipped washstand. Crane, with his sergeant at his side, began the search with brisk efficiency, checking under the mattress, inside the pillowcase, and behind the sparse furnishings. Ellen stood in the doorway, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly, her eyes following every movement. Miss Marple, standing just outside, noted the girl's rigid posture and the way her lips trembled, as if she were bracing for a blow. The inspector's initial sweep yielded nothing, no glint of sapphire, no trace of silver. He grunted, clearly frustrated, and turned to Ellen. "Anything you'd care to tell us, girl? Save us the trouble of tearing this place apart." Ellen shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I've nothing to hide, sir. I told you, I didn't take it." But her eyes darted to the floor, and Miss Marple, with her keen sense for the unspoken, followed her gaze. The floorboards, worn but clean, showed no obvious signs of tampering, but one board near the bed seemed slightly misaligned, its edge raised just enough to catch the light. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her tone deferential, "might you have a look at the floor? Sometimes in old houses like this, things find their way into unexpected places." She thought of a saint. Mary Mead Cottage, where a stolen locket had been hidden beneath a loose board, discovered only when a child's marble rolled into the gap. Crane, though sceptical, nodded to his sergeant, who knelt and pried at the board with a pocket-knife. It lifted easily, revealing a small cavity beneath. Ellen's breath caught, a sharp sound in the quiet room, and Miss Marple saw her hands clench into fists. The sergeant reached in and withdrew a small cloth pouch, its contents rustling faintly. Crane opened it, his expression darkening as he pulled out a pawn ticket and a folded letter, but no necklace. The ticket, from a London pawnbroker, described a single sapphire pendant, not the full necklace, with a value far below what the heirloom would fetch. The letter, in a scrawled hand, was addressed to Ellen and signed by someone named Tom. Crane unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning it quickly before he read aloud, his voice gruff. "Ellen, I'm in deep, worse than before. They're after me, and I need money quick. Get what you can, or I'm done for. Don't tell no one. Tom," he fixed Ellen with a stern look. "Your brother, I presume. Care to explain this?" Ellen's face crumpled, and she sank onto the bed, her hands covering her face. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't take the necklace, I swear. That sapphire, it's just a trinket, something I found years ago. I pawned it to help Tom, but I didn't touch Lady Beatrice's jewel." Her words tumbled out, desperate and halting, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her fear, but also the gaps in her story. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Ellen, my dear, a trinket doesn't fetch a pawn ticket like that. And this letter suggests your brother's in serious trouble. If you know something about the necklace, it's better to tell us now. Secrets, you know, have a way of growing heavier with time." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead girl, who had hidden her brother's thefts, only to find herself entangled in his crimes. Ellen shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't take it," she repeated. "I was in the ballroom, serving drinks, but I didn't touch her ladyship's necklace. Please, you have to believe me." But her voice broke, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the inspector's, as if the weight of her brother's troubles pressed her into silence. Crane pocketed the ticket and letter, his expression grim. "We'll check this with the pawnbroker," he said, "and we're not done searching. If that necklace is here, we'll find it." He turned to Miss Marple, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Good eye on the floorboard, ma'am. Anything else you've noticed?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Only that people often hide what they fear to lose, Inspector. And sometimes what they hide is not the thing itself, but the reason for wanting it." Her words, soft and cryptic, lingered in the air, and she saw Ellen's shoulders hunch, as if struck by their weight. As Crane and his sergeant moved on to search the other rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her thoughts turning over the discovery. The pawn ticket, for a single sapphire, was intriguing. It suggested Ellen had access to valuable gems, but not the full necklace. Had she broken it apart, selling pieces to avoid suspicion? Miss Marple recalled a saint, Mary Mead thief, who had dismantled a stolen candelabrum, selling its silver bit by bit. "A clever girl might do the same," she murmured, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. The letter from Tom, with its desperate tone, confirmed Ellen's motive. Family loyalty, pressed to the breaking point by fear. But the necklace itself remained elusive, and Miss Marple felt certain that the truth lay not just in what was found, but in what was still hidden. As she descended the stairs, her mind fixed on the alcove, the bead and Ellen's trembling hands, she knew the search was far from over. Chapter 10. Confronting the Truth. The drawing-room of Haverford Manor, with its high ceilings and walls adorned with ancestral portraits, felt like a stage set for judgment. As the late afternoon light filtered through the mullioned windows, Miss Jane Marple had requested that Inspector Harold Crane gather the suspects: Lady Beatrice Haverford, Mr. Reginald Thornton, Mr. Silas Pembroke, and Ellen Carter, in this elegant space, ostensibly for a final round of questions. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm, and Miss Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair with her knitting in her lap, appeared as serene as ever, her needles clicking softly like the ticking of a clock. Yet her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, and she sensed that the threads of the sapphire necklace's mystery were about to be woven into a coherent pattern. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace, his broad frame casting a shadow across the hearth, his notebook tucked away as if he sensed this moment required more than his usual methods. The suspects sat in a loose semicircle, their postures revealing their unease. Lady Beatrice, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale but composed. Thornton, leaning back with a practised air of nonchalance, though his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. Pembroke, his thin frame rigid, his watch chain clutched like a talisman. And Ellen, perched on the edge of her chair, her eyes downcast and her hands twisting her apron into knots. Miss Marple, with her quiet authority, took the lead, her voice gentle but commanding attention. "I find," she began, her tone conversational, "that a stolen jewel often reveals more about the people around it than about itself. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a case once, a silver teapot gone missing, and it was the reasons behind the theft that told the true story." She paused, her needles pausing briefly, and saw the suspects shift, their eyes flickering toward her. Crane, catching her cue, nodded gruffly. "Miss Marple has a way of seeing things, and I've asked her to share her thoughts. So, let's hear it, ma'am. What's your take on this business?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild. "Let us begin with you, Lady Beatrice," she said, turning to the hostess. "Your necklace is a treasure, insured for a great sum, I understand. A lesser mind might wonder if you had reason to stage its loss, perhaps to claim the insurance. But I've seen your distress, and I believe it's genuine. A woman doesn't part with a family heirloom so lightly, does she?" Her tone was kind, but her words carried a subtle challenge, and Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, her hands fluttering. "Good heavens, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "I'd never dream of such a thing. The necklace is my family's pride, not a means to an end." Her sincerity was palpable, and Miss Marple nodded, satisfied that greed was not her motive. She turned to Thornton, her gaze steady. "Mr. Thornton, you're a man of charm and ambition, but the servants talk of debts. Investments gone awry, perhaps? A necklace like that could tempt a man in need, and you were dancing with Lady Beatrice when it vanished. Your alibi with Mrs. Langley is less certain than you claim, isn't it?" Her voice was soft, but her words cut sharply, and she saw Thornton's smile falter, his fingers stilling on the armrest. "I assure you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained, "my finances are my own concern, and I had no hand in this theft. I was with Lady Beatrice only briefly, and then with others I saw nothing amiss." But his eyes flicked to Pembroke, as if seeking an ally, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling a saint. Mary Mead swindler whose charm had crumbled under scrutiny. To Pembroke, she said, "And you, Mr. Pembroke, know the necklace's weaknesses, its clasp so delicate, yet you insist it was secure. A jeweller in financial straits, as I hear you are, might see opportunity in such knowledge. You were near the alcove, weren't you, when Lady Beatrice paused there?" Her question was gentle, but Pembroke's face flushed, his fingers tightening on his watch chain. "I had no part in it," he said sharply. "My appraisal was honest, and I was nowhere near the alcove when the theft occurred. I'm a professional, not a thief." His defensiveness was telling, but Miss Marple sensed it stemmed more from pride than guilt. Finally, she turned to Ellen, her voice softening. "Ellen, my dear, you've been afraid, haven't you? That bruise on your wrist, your brother's letter, the pawn ticket for a sapphire, they tell a story of desperation. You were in the ballroom, serving drinks, moving through the crowd, and you were near the alcove, weren't you, when Lady Beatrice stepped there after her dance? A quick hand, a loosened clasp, and the necklace was yours." Her words, delivered with quiet certainty, hung in the air, and Ellen's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to," Ellen whispered, her voice breaking. "It was for Tom, my brother. He's in trouble, bad men after him. I only took it to sell one stone, to get him away. I hid the rest, thinking I could return it later." Her confession poured out, raw and anguished, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Miss Marple's expression was one of sorrow, not triumph. "You stood behind the curtain in the alcove," she said gently, "and when Lady Beatrice paused there, you slipped the necklace off, the clasp, as Mr. Pembroke said, was delicate, easy for a quick hand to undo. The bead we found was from your apron, wasn't it? A small thing, but it placed you there." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead girl, who had stolen to save a loved one, her regret as heavy as her crime. Ellen nodded, her sobs quieting. "It's in the coal shed, hidden in a sack. I didn't want to keep it, I swear." Crane, his face a mix of surprise and grudging respect, dispatched his sergeant to check the shed, and Miss Marple sat back, her needles resuming their rhythm. The room was silent, save for Ellen's soft weeping, and Miss Marple felt the weight of human frailty, so often the root of such mysteries. Chapter 11. The Confessions Wait. The drawing-room of Haverford Manor, its air still heavy with the aftermath of Ellen Carter's confession, seemed to hold its breath as the reality of the theft settled over the gathered company. The late afternoon light had softened, casting a muted glow across the polished furniture and the sombre faces of the suspects. Miss Jane Marple, seated with her knitting in her lap, her needles now still, observed the scene with a quiet sorrow, her heart attuned to the human frailties that had unravelled the mystery of the sapphire necklace. Ellen, crumpled in her chair, her face streaked with tears, was a picture of remorse, her slender frame shaking as she clutched her apron. Lady Beatrice Haverford, Mr. Reginald Thornton, and Mr. Silas Pembroke sat in stunned silence, each processing the maid's admission in their own way. Inspector Harold Crane, his earlier scepticism replaced by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's insight, stood near the door, his broad frame poised as if ready to spring into action. He had dispatched his sergeant to the coal shed to verify Ellen's claim, and the room waited in tense anticipation for the outcome. Miss Marple, her eyes gentle but unyielding, turned to Ellen, her voice soft as she spoke. "My dear, you've told us the truth about taking the necklace, and that's a brave thing. But could you tell us exactly how it happened? It will help us understand and perhaps ease the burden you're carrying." Ellen lifted her tear-stained face, her voice trembling but clear. "It was during the waltz, ma'am," she said, her words halting. "I was serving drinks, moving through the crowd like always." I saw Lady Beatrice dancing with Mr. Thornton, her necklace shining so bright it hurt to look at it. I'd heard about its value. Everyone in the servants' hall talked of it, and I knew Tom needed money bad. He wrote me that letter saying they'd hurt him if he didn't pay. She paused, swallowing hard, and Miss Marple noted the bruise on her wrist, now a stark reminder of her brother's desperate straits. "Go on, Ellen," Miss Marple prompted, her tone as kind as a village aunt's. "You saw your chance, didn't you, when Lady Beatrice stepped away?" Ellen nodded, her hands twisting the apron's hem. She went to the alcove by the French windows, just for a moment, to catch her breath. The curtains were heavy, and I slipped behind them, holding my tray so no one would notice. The clasp, it was loose, just like Mr. Pembroke said it could be. I'd seen him show Lady Beatrice how it worked that morning when he appraised it. I just reached out and unhooked it, quick as I could. It came off in my hand, and I tucked it into my apron pocket. No one saw, not with all the dancing in the crowd. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands again, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple's expression was one of compassion, tempered by the clarity of understanding. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead girl, a seamstress who had stolen a bolt of silk to pay for her sister's medicine, her regret as palpable as Ellen's. "And the sapphire you pawned?" she asked gently. "You broke the necklace apart, didn't you, to avoid suspicion?" Ellen nodded, her voice muffled. "I took one stone out, just one, and sold it in London last week. I thought I could raise enough for Tom to get away, and no one would know the necklace was missing if I returned the rest later. I hid it in the coal shed, in a sack under some old tools. I didn't want to keep it honest, but Tom was so scared." Her words carried the weight of loyalty and fear, and Miss Marple saw the truth in them, though it was a truth born of desperation. Lady Beatrice, who had been silent, spoke at last, her voice trembling but not unkind. "Oh, Ellen, how could you? That necklace, it's been in my family for generations, but I see you're sorry, and I know what it is to care for family." Her eyes, red-rimmed, held a flicker of pity, and Miss Marple noted the genuine sorrow in her tone, a contrast to the indignation she might have expected. Thornton, his charm subdued, leaned forward, his voice low. "A sad business, Miss Carter, but you've done right to confess. It saves us all a deal of trouble." His words were sympathetic, but Miss Marple caught the faint relief in his eyes, as if Ellen's confession had lifted a shadow from his own shoulders. Pembroke, meanwhile, remained rigid, his fingers still clutching his watch chain, his silence suggesting a man relieved to be out of the spotlight. Before anyone could say more, the sergeant returned, his face flushed from his haste. In his hand was a small, coal-dusted sack, and from it he drew the sapphire necklace, its silver setting tarnished but intact, the remaining stones glinting faintly in the dim light. "Found it exactly where she said, sir," he reported to Crane. "Hidden in the shed, just like she described." Crane took the necklace, examining it closely before passing it to Lady Beatrice, who gasped softly, her fingers trembling as she touched the familiar stones. "It's really here," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and sorrow. "But one sapphire is missing, just as she said." Miss Marple nodded. her thoughts turning over the case's resolution. "A single stone sold to save a brother," she said softly, almost to herself. "Insane. Mary Mead, we had a boy who took a silver spoon for much the same reason. It's a heavy price, Ellen, and I'm sorry it came to this." Her words were kind, but they carried the weight of experience, and she saw Ellen's shoulders slump, as if the confession had drained her last reserves. Crane, his expression stern but not unkind, turned to Ellen. "You'll have to come with us, Miss Carter." "Theft is theft, whatever the reason, but your cooperation will be noted." He signalled to the sergeant, who gently took Ellen's arm, leading her from the room, as her sobs echoed softly in the silence. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched, looked at the remaining suspects, her mind lingering on the human cost of the crime. "Desperation blinds us to consequences," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "But truth, you know, has a way of shining through like a sapphire in the dust." As the room emptied, she felt the familiar ache of a case resolved, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding of the frailties that drove it. Chapter 12. The case closed. The morning sun rose gently over Haverford Manor, its golden rays softening the stone facade and casting a serene glow across the dew-kissed lawns. The frenetic energy of the past days, driven by the theft of the sapphire necklace, had subsided, leaving the household in a state of quiet recovery. Miss Jane Marple, her small suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood in the manor's entrance hall, preparing to depart for the train back to St. Mary Mead. Lady Beatrice Haverford, her composure restored, though her eyes still held a trace of weariness, clasped Miss Marple's hands in gratitude. "You've been a godsend, Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm but tinged with lingering sorrow. "To think it was poor Ellen, driven to such a thing. I'm grateful the necklace is back, but I can't help feeling for her." The sapphire necklace, now restored to its velvet-lined case, save for the single missing stone, lay safely in the manor's vault, its return a bittersweet triumph. Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but firm. "Oh, I only see what people show me, Lady Beatrice," she said, her tone deflecting the praise. "But I'm glad the truth came out. It's often the way, you know. Secrets come to light when we least expect it." Her thoughts drifted to a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had hidden her son's misdeeds, only for a neighbour's chance remark to unravel the truth. She patted Lady Beatrice's hand, her eyes kind but already turning inward, piecing together the final threads of the case. Inspector Harold Crane, his usual brusqueness softened by the case's resolution, approached to bid her farewell. "You've got a sharp mind, Miss Marple," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "I'll admit, I didn't see the maid for it until you pointed the way. That bead in the alcove, sharp work, that." He shook her hand, his grip firm, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush of his cheeks, as if he were unaccustomed to giving credit. "You'd have found her out, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "I only nudged things along. In my village, we learn to notice the little things, a glance, a gesture, a bead left behind." She thought of the alcove, the scuff mark and Ellen's trembling hands, each a clue that had led to the coal shed and the necklace's recovery. The single pawned sapphire, sold to save a brother, was a small loss compared to the weight of Ellen's remorse, now facing the consequences of her act. As a footman carried her suitcase to the waiting carriage, Miss Marple glanced back at the manor, where Mr. Reginald Thornton and Mr. Silas Pembroke were preparing to depart. Thornton, his charm undimmed despite the shadow of his debts, had offered a polished farewell, but Miss Marple sensed his relief at escaping further scrutiny. Pembroke, his watch chain still a nervous habit, had muttered something about returning to London, his reputation intact but his pride bruised. Neither had played a role in the theft, but their secrets, debts and professional pressures had coloured the case, reminding Miss Marple of the myriad motives that swirl around a jewel like the sapphire necklace. The carriage rolled toward the station, and Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as she began a new row. The countryside passed in a blur of green fields and hedgerows, and her mind wandered over the events of the past days. The necklace, with its glittering allure, had been a catalyst, drawing out greed, fear, and loyalty in equal measure. Ellen's desperation, born of love for her brother, had driven her to a reckless act, much like a saint. Mary Mead girl, who had stolen to protect her family, only to find redemption in confession. As the train whistle sounded in the distance, Miss Marple reflected on the human heart, so easily swayed by want and duty. "Jewels shine," she murmured, her needle steady, "but it's the shadows they cast that tell the story." With a faint smile, she tucked her knitting away, her thoughts already turning to Saint, Mary Mead, and the quiet mysteries that awaited her there, certain that another puzzle would soon find its way to her, as puzzles always did.